This is the Doc and Krueger cast, the official podcast of Doc and Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 18, The Fate Core System. Hello friends, and welcome to another episode of the Doc and Krueger cast. I'm Chris Krueger, and I'm joined today by Adam Doc Brackin.
Hey everybody.
And we're continuing our series on games that influenced us as designers, and particularly the Roll With It system. And today we're talking about a very cool game that many of you might be familiar with, the Fate Core system, which is published by Evil Hat Productions. This is actually a system that has a kind of a storied history in a way, because it is ultimately derived from Fudge.
Yeah.
Which was kind of this open-ended, generic system from back in the day. That has kind of now evolved into the form we have now, because I believe that Fudge was actually a Creative Commons game when it first came out, and so people were free to like reproduce it and remix it and that sort of thing. And so I believe the first game that used Fate as we know it today was kind of like Fudge being modded until we got to, I forget if it was Spirit of the Century or Dresden Files that came first. But those were the two kind of like first games in Fate. Yeah. And that was even before Fate Core existed. Those were just like it was a Fate game. And then I think someone at one point sort of like wrote down a generic version of the rules, the sort of core systems behind it, but it wasn't actually a generic system until they published Fate Core.
Yep. It is a deep family that has a rather interesting history now, 15, 20 years. Mm-hmm. So I got to do a shout out to Atomic Robo, man. Mm-hmm. That is my absolute favorite in terms of, Fate and using Fudge dice in a system like that. That said, I would also do a quick shout out to the board game Dresden Files, which has now got an app, which is completely loyal to the core idea behind Dresden, as a RPG mechanic. So I think that it's really neat whenever you use those dice correctly. If you do them badly, they're terrible. But let's talk about how that has inspired us as designers. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll say just as a designer in general, not necessarily for Roll With It, I found the dice system to be very, very elegant. There was a time in my design career, I would say, where I was maybe a little bit too interested in having like different systems and mechanics for a whole bunch of different things. And I always kind of had this sort of general attitude of I want to have it be as open-ended as possible. Like I think in one of my early games I had like, here are the three general types of conflicts or types of roles you might have, mm-hmm. and then those are each resolved in kind of their own way. Fate, when I read Fate Core, struck me as just this really elegant solution to what I was trying to do, which is they have, you've got your stat that gives you sort of a modifier to start, mm-hmm. And then you roll, the 4 Fudge dice on top of it to kind of see to what degree you kind of go like over or underperform relative to your ability. Yeah. And either you're trying to beat a challenge number with that, or you're trying to overcome an opposed roll that works the same way as your roll. And that's just a really simple, elegant way of being able to do really any sort of roll, any sort of challenge, because it's either going up against someone who's opposing you, or it's just trying to overcome something that's going to be challenging for you.
And fundamentally, it's going to be on a bell curve. We talked about this during our dice episode, and I think that it's incredibly important to recognize what a bell curve does. It centralizes success. So it makes horrible failure and astounding successes outliers. And I mean that in the mathematical sense in a very real way. So you're not going to be doing superhuman things in a sort of a 1 in 20 chance all the time, nor are you going to be failing like, a terrible punk and on that same sort of a scale. Instead, what you're going to be doing is probably rolling about what your stat is, unless you get really lucky or really unlucky. And that sort of normalizing effect, I think, has a strong impact on the genre. So like I was saying in that DICE episode, one of my very favorite systems of all time is Mean Streets, because it recognizes that and it does that. And it's a noir setting. Well, guess what? Dresden is a noir setting. It's a magical noir setting, and he's a detective, but that's basically what it is. So it fits really well for that. Also, you've got things like Atomic Robo, which are action scientists. And as long as you, let's say, adjust the slider so that awesome is the standard, which it is, then that makes sense there too. So you're probably not going to do something superhuman, and you're probably not going to fail terribly, but you're going to continue to do something heroic, as long as that's the sort of the average and the standard. And so that, I think, is really fun when you recognize that the use of fate for a setting, even though it's, like you say, genre agnostic, I think you really need to figure out what normal is for your characters. It may not be normal for the world, but it may be normal for your characters. And if you break that, you're not gonna have fun in Fate, I think. That's my personal experience and my personal take on Fate. That said, I agree, it's a brilliant system. Please continue.
I think that one of the things that more directly inspired different aspects of the Roll With It system and our other work is character aspects.
Yes.
And so when you come up with your character, and different variations on Fate will do this in different ways, but effectively you come up with a number of character aspects which are you can phrase them pretty open-endedly. So it can be anything from here's a sort of a job that I do, to an attitude I have, to maybe like a representative quote that sort of indicates your way of thinking or your way of doing things, or like maybe like a special ability you have, or whatever the case might be. We talked about the dice roll system, and because you're rolling 4 fudge dice, there's a pretty high level of swing you can have relative to your base number, but usually you can count on it being pretty close to your base number. But there's also a pretty good chance that you're going to be underperforming if you're rolling poorly. And generally speaking, depending on how you balance it and that sort of thing, you can find yourself coming up short, or maybe not succeeding as well as you would like to on a lot of rolls.
It's true.
And I think that in a way is intentional, because what they do is these aspects can be invoked to either let you re-roll or to let you add a bonus modifier to whatever you did roll.
Yes.
And that sometimes bumps you up over the edge. In order to do that, though, you need to spend a fate point. And these fate points are, we didn't talk very much about Artha when we talked about Burning Wheel.
Or at all, I think.
Yeah, no, we've talked about it before, though, on the cast.
Yeah, that's true.
Essentially, what these fate points do is it's something that the GM rewards you with for good role play, and that you spend to kind of give yourself mechanical benefits. And so when you do that, though, you spend a fate point, and that allows you to invoke an aspect, and you have to be able to justify why that aspect applies to what you're doing. Say I'm trying something that I'm very bad at. If we want to talk about Atomic Robo, maybe I am an action chemist. I'm not very good at, say, biology or something like that.
Nice.
I'm attempting biology. I'm really bad at it. And maybe I have got my 3 aspects. One of them is like, God, I hate biology, or something like that. And so if I tried to evoke that one to be like, yeah, I'm totally retry this and do it better. The GM might be able to push back and say you're going to have to explain to me why you think that you're hating biology is going to help you do this. And maybe you say that it's my character's being stubborn or something like that. So it kind of adds a little bit of personality, and you have to kind of justify the way you're role playing.
I would allow it.
You could also say, though, that you're going to ignore that one and draw on a different aspect that's but I'm a really stubborn son of a gun.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to invoke that one to say that I'm going to keep at it.
Yeah.
In that particular case.
I played a character one time in that system in Atomic Robo. One of my favorite characters of all time ever. He was kind of a Brock Sampson kind of character, if you know that reference at all. But basically, what Sam, that was his name, his solution was to punch it. And that was actually one of my, I think, stunts, was to just, punch it until it breaks. And I used that in so many different ways. There's a door and it's locked, and okay, I punch it, and it worked. But at the same time, he was himself a xenobiologist and other things. And so he had lots of skills. But what I really enjoy about the system overall is that idea of being specialist. And I think that the, even just Fate Core really encourages you to be specialists. And as specialists, then you draw together as a team. And so I think there's a lot of teamwork. That's the other part of it that I think of when I think of Fate, is that you need a table that works together well. and it's going to encourage you mechanically to work together well. And instead of trying to have everyone at the table roll perception or everyone at the table, roll for the firefight, that's not the way it works. It's just not it. You've got somebody who's going to handle the thing that's coming at you right now. And that's a philosophy that I think we have adopted too, because I really don't like having just cloned characters. I'm a warrior with a sword. Well, I'm a magician. Okay, well, what do you both do? You throw a lot of damage at an enemy. Mm-hmm. That's just a reskin on the same character. I'm sorry, but the lore is a little different, but you're still basically playing the same kind of character. Whereas if you are playing in a game where one is literally a small child and someone else is a scientist and someone else is a warrior, then suddenly that becomes, I think, meaningful both narratively and mechanically, and that is a strength of Fate.
And the other thing that aspects do, and that a few other things in the system do, is kind of draw out the personality and the story of your character. It helps to prompt the story. And I mentioned already there's the great feedback loop of getting rewarded for playing your character so that you can help your mechanics that can help you advance your story, etc. But there's also in a lot of Fate systems kind of like a few things you're supposed to assign to your character. Like, for example, your issue, I think is what they call it in Fate Core, where your character
that sounds right.
has an issue built in that's kind of going to be something the GM can draw on or that you can draw on if you're kind of at a loss for like, how can I add a complication right now? Yeah. But also kind of whenever that comes up, you've got a chance to get fate points and stuff like that. So it kind of embraces the idea, like the three kind of core requirements that they suggest for characters, or rather they say the characters that work best in Fate are competent, meaning that they're highly skilled. They're going to be expected to do good stuff, do it well. They're proactive, meaning that they're going to be motivated to go do things. They're going to act instead of just like sitting back and seeing what happens, because the whole idea is you want to drive the story forward. You want to drive the adventure forward.
Absolutely.
And they're going to be dramatic. And so there's going to be interesting stuff that happens to and around them that will help to be entertaining ultimately. And everything kind of on the character sheet kind of all points back to those three core things that your character ought to be, that the game becomes about, depending on what it is that you're doing with it. So you might be pushing a particular theme or a particular feeling depending on the setting you're using and that sort of deal. But everything is kind of built around driving a particular type of story forward.
Yep. And it's funny because if you reverse those and you take their opposites, you have an incompetent character who doesn't do much, that kind of a thing. And just take any media form, like a TV show or a movie. Those are actually the movies I hate. I truly hate. Whenever you're watching a TV show and you've got this incompetent character who does a really stupid thing, I'm like, okay, I've lost my empathy with that character now. Everything that happens from here on is their own fault. And from a completely cynical point of view, they kind of deserve what they get at this point. I'm not rooting for them anymore. And I think that's what this is really about, is that if you have characters with those three things that you said, you've got characters that you're rooting for. And I want to sit across the table as a player from another player who is playing a character I'm rooting for. Even though I am also playing a character right next to him, I want to make sure that we are, on this awesome team moving forward together kind of a thing. And that is something that Fate does incredibly well. Super, super well.
And something else that I think is a cool thing that Fate games tend to do is they introduce conditions, either whether they're like permanent consequences that your character takes after suffering damage or failing at certain things, whatever the case might be.
Yeah, like a broken arm or depression or discouragement, anything on the whole spectrum there.
Or even something that I don't find myself using a ton just because I don't remember to a lot of times is temporary aspects for a scene or for a location or whatever the case might be.
Like if it's raining.
Sure, yeah. Like if it's like we might have a scene aspect or a location aspect that says because it's raining, certain types of things are going to be more difficult, and that can be invoked by the GM or the players in the same way that a character aspect can be invoked to alter a role or that sort of thing. And so it really does encourage kind of this sort of situational approach. Each each scene or each kind of set piece, whatever the case might be, can kind of really take on its own unique feeling.
Yeah.
And it's all supported again by this very elegant, smooth system. And so I've actually seen some people at the time of recording, there's this thing going on right now on Twitter called hashtag AprilTTRPGmaker, which is essentially an opportunity for role-playing game makers to kind of get acquainted with each other and to talk about their process and that sort of thing. And so I've seen some interesting conversations come up around that. Mm-hmm. One of which was not directly related to it, but maybe prompted by it, was a conversation about Fate versus Powered by the Apocalypse system games, which we'll be talking about later on in the season, and how they're both kind of known for being very versatile. Fate, because it can be adapted into anything pretty easily. Powered by the Apocalypse, because you can kind of build around any concept. But Powered by the Apocalypse has a very specific feeling and way of working that's specific to each setting. Yeah. You can't just take the Powered by the Apocalypse core rules, so to speak, and attack it onto anything. I guess you could maybe, but
there's a ton of prep work because you've got to choose your playbooks and stuff like that beforehand, and then you're kind of locked in. But that's a good thing.
Yeah,
and we'll talk about that more. Well, as long as we're talking about mashups, there's another system that I think combines the absolute best of Burning Wheel and the absolute best of Fate, and that is a system called Chronica Feudalis. I'm an American, so I'm going to say it that way. It's probably Chronica Feudali, technically, but it takes this sort of old French term for a very simple approach to knights and castles, and call it a realistic take on being an ancient fantasy warrior, instead of it being about magic. And I absolutely loved that system. I used that system for a little thing I did on Templar that I think is probably going to make it into one of our setting books at some point. But I highly, highly recommend Chronica Feudalis, and in the sense that it uses these aspects and it uses these elements incredibly well, but then also uses life paths and blends those two together, but in an incredibly approachable way. And I think that at the end of the day, that's what you and I have tried to do with our design, is to make sure everything was approachable. There's so many cool, deep, rich, complicated things out there, like, grapple mechanics or whatever, that you could, make a system around. But I think for us, we have been so focused on making sure that it was simple, that it was consistent, and that it was kind of universal. And whenever I think of Fate, first and foremost, what I think of is almost like the proto sort of birth of motifs, which is a core concept that we use in our systems. This idea of having character motifs that can be built around, a thing that they have, or something that they're feeling, or a goal. And it's very broad. And you came up with that term, motif. I loved it. Originally, we called it something else. We called it like character elements.
And roll with it, we called it story elements.
Yeah, that's right.
But in Mind, which this was story elements were kind of an offshoot of this thing. In Mind, we actually called it aspects. Because I feel like that captured it best, because it kind of covers everything that I think that aspects and Fate cover.
Sure, yeah.
And aspects and Fate were a very large inspiration for those things.
They were, it's true, yeah.
It's kind of like these defining aspects of your character that can be drawn upon for everything they do and play into everything they do in some way.
Yep. And I think that we borrowed the idea of conditions as well for some of our early playtesting of that, and we're still developing that, so we'll see where it ends up. That'd be interesting. But I think that the strength of Fate in terms of narrative storytelling is not just in the mechanics of the dice that were used, but in those abilities to assign almost like adjective words and adverb words to the character that are either long-standing or temporary. And
it's adaptable.
It's adaptable. That's a good way to say it.
You can have your story be driven by that system in a lot of cool ways, but the system can also react to the story that you're telling. And that is something that Fate is very, very good at.
Yeah, very, very well said. Lots and lots of modifiers based on stuff that's happened before narratively. And I find that incredibly inspirational.
Well, thank you for joining us for Season 1, Episode 18 of the Doc and Krueger Cast, our discussion on the Fate core system. This is obviously barely scratching the surface of Fate. There's so much more we could talk about, but definitely another one of those systems that's worth checking out, definitely worth sort of looking at their design and how they approach things. Hugely influential system across the industry, not just to us.
Boy, howdy.
Definitely some good stuff. I'm Chris.
I'm Doc.
And we'll see you next time. The Doc and Krueger cast is a production of Doc and Krueger Games, jointly hosted by Adam Doc Brackin and Chris Krueger. The theme music was composed by Nick Krueger. The Roll With It system is available now. You can find it and our other games through our website, docandkrueger.com.